Hello and welcome all of you to this afternoon plenary session on U.S. foreign policy. We have a terrific panel here this afternoon. To my right is Congressman Jim Leach. To his right, Congressman Chris Dodd. To his right, as always, Senator Orrin. And to his right, Governor Bill Owens, who's a late addition to the panel, our governor of Colorado. Senator Joe Biden, I know, is going to be joining us very shortly. I would beg people to turn off their cell phones if that isn't asking too much. Just it's so much better for everyone in the audience and on the panel. My name's Tom Friedman. I'm the Foreign Affairs columnist for the New York Times. And I'm going to kick off with a few questions here for the panel, and then eventually we'll open it up to you all. And we look forward to a lot of participation. I've been traveling around Europe for the past 2 weeks doing a documentary for the Discovery Times channel. We've been in London and France and Germany and now here. And certainly the issue of America-Europe relations is something very, very high on everyone's agenda. And I'm curious to know, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer this question as an opening. When you go home, and you go back to the house, Jim, and your colleagues say, you know, I've been reading about U.S.-Europe relations. Things seem to be a little choppy. You were just over in Europe, Jim. What are your impressions? What will you tell them?
Well, it's my sense that underlying values are profoundly similar. There is a difference in the European character that isn't greatly different than American, but somewhat. And then there's a very large difference between European attitudes and current political attitudes in the United States. And I would simply stress that America is more than government. It's a society. And that as a society, there's a great identity with Europe. Our political system today is probably a little bit out of step with European judgment, but I view it as a more judgmental than a deep divide between our cultures.
Nothing permanent.
I view nothing irreparable, and nothing that there are great nuances of differentiations. But in terms of basic values, commonalities of philosophy, extraordinarily similar.
Senator Dodd, what will you tell the folks back in the Senate when you get back?
Well, first of all, being at Davos isn't necessarily being in Europe.
It's a different planet.
At least I hope not, to some extent. So it's unfair necessarily to try to get a real read. I just before coming here participated with Jim, in fact, at a forum on U.S. foreign policy. And I think, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, I came in late to that, but I think most of the audience were people from Switzerland and some from Germany that were there, not necessarily direct participants here at Davos. So it might have been a better reflection of European thinking or thoughts on U.S. foreign policy. And at the very least, Tom, it's a frayed relationship. I was telling the audience we were talking about the International Criminal Court, and my father was too old to fight in World War II, but he came to Europe in 1945, in the summer of 45, when I was a year old, as the executive trial counsel at the Nuremberg trials. And as a result of that experience here in a year and a half, developed great friendships. I spent summers visiting friends that my parents had met or my father had met in Europe. People came to our house and stayed. The pond was, growing up, was something that was far smaller than anything I'm familiar with today. So I agree with Jim. I think the underlying values are there. We're spending a lot of time talking about differences. And I hope, and I say this as a Democrat and someone who has serious disagreements with the Bush administration on domestic and foreign policy, that it's incumbent, I think, upon those of us who are in leadership positions to really work at this juncture on some of the commonality. If we spend the rest of this 4 years on things we disagree with, and there are plenty to identify, I think we put this relationship at risk further, which I think is unhealthy for both of us. And we've got to get over this fixation on personality issues, start focusing on policy questions, particularly for people who depend upon Europe and the United States for improving the quality of their lives.
Let me follow that up. If when you get home, our new Secretary of State, Secretary of State Rice calls you up and says, Senator Dodd, you were just over in Europe, and what would you advise me to do to get off on a good start?
Well, I thought you gave pretty good advice this morning in your column, and read my ears, I think is what you said. And I think coming and listening, I think the Bush administration needs to come and spend some time really listening to people. You're not going to like what you hear to begin with, but I think it's very important that they hear how people feel. You've got to do that before you can then get to the issue of now what should we work on together in these next 4 years. I'm here to do that. So I'd strongly recommend she get here soon, either directly or indirectly, and start those lines of communication very, very quickly.
Senator Hatch.
Well, you know, President Bush has probably addressed the UN General Assembly more than any president in his first term. In fact, not probably, he has. They may not have liked what they've heard, but nevertheless, he's been there. Some 100 countries throughout the world have been supportive in one way or another, either through intelligence, military, you name it. Some of the larger European countries have not been, but that's not unusual for us. We happen to love Europe. My brother died in the Second World War to help Europe and the world at large. He was on the famous Plessy oil raid and gave his life for you and me, for freedom. America has never been an imperialist nation. We have always participated in helping to preserve and protect freedom in the areas that we've gone into. And although all of us are concerned about where we are in Iraq and worried about it, there's not much doubt that that was an evil, corrupt regime. And I go back a few years when it was very apparent France did not support when the Bosnian crisis erupted in the early 90s. France was not supportive, did not want to end the embargo. But when we decided, and by the way, as a result, of course, the Serbs went into Slovenia, then they went into Croatia, Bosnia, and created mass havoc. And finally, we decided to go in there and solve that problem. Today, the French are the key people in Kosovo. French are key people in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been tremendously, it has been a tremendous illustration of what can happen if we do things that are worthwhile. And I might also add that in spite of our differences, we all have to join together as Western nations against terrorism. And in many respects, Europe has more problems and may have more problems than the United States of America. There are tens of millions of Muslims in Europe now, some of whom are antagonistic to European values. And as you all know, it's a constant problem now for Europe, and I don't think you can sit back and do nothing against these Islamic fascists, against these terrorists, and consider Osama bin Laden somebody that we should not all organize against. We have Western interests, we have Western enemies in common, and right now some of those enemies are Islamic fascists. So there's every reason for us to continue to have dialogue, get together, and I agree with Senator Dodd. It would be a good thing for the United States to continue to listen, to take the best ideas we can from our friends in Europe, and, of course, hopefully get you to assist. The best speech I ever heard in a joint session of Congress in my 28 years in Congress was Tony Blair's. I've never heard anything like that one. It was just great. He's had a great deal of guts, and I think he deserves to be listened to, as do others.
Senator Hatch, let me follow up with you, just as I did with Chris. With the president coming over in 3 weeks, is there anything, again, if you get back and he called you up, you had a chance to talk to him, that you'd advise him either substantively or style-wise to approach this trip a little bit different on the basis of things you've learned either now or before?
Chris has told me what I can't say, so I won't say it. Those of us who know George Bush very well, and I'll be honest with you, I was with him Tuesday in the White House, and I saw a slightly different person. Everybody matures in these type of positions. But I see a take-charge person who really wants to listen. And he is a listener. People have always underestimated George Bush. And you should never do that. This is a very bright guy. He has very deep feelings. He knows where he's going. He's not the idiot that some in Europe would have the Europeans believe, some editorial writers and others. He's a person of deep convictions. And if you meet him halfway, he's going to be an asset to you and an ally to you. You can go back in time and realize that this is true of a lot of people who have represented our country. But I think he's got a new Secretary of State who is one of the brilliant people in this world. She's a very, very competent, good person. And I believe she'll be open to Europe. She understands how important Europe is. She understands how important Western values are. She's going to have an excellent deputy in Bob Zoellick, who has traveled the world in the interest of free trade and as our trade representative. I know them both very, very well. I think you're going to like her. I know you're going to like him as well. And frankly, I think you'll like the president, and I personally believe that he would like nothing better than to have Western countries unified for freedom and for ending terrorism in the world. And if you meet him halfway, I think you're going to find a very, very good ally.
Thank you. First of all, I want to welcome Senator Biden. Joe, good to have you here. We're going down the row here and asking people about their trip impressions, and to go to Governor Owens, and then we'll come back to you, Joe. Governor Owens.
Well, I guess if I was asked about my impression, I've been coming to Davos for many years. I've spent a lot of time while I'm a governor, and governors typically aren't very involved in foreign policy. I have been. My brother's an American diplomat, and for years I was a tour guide as a younger man in Russia and the Soviet Union. You know, there's always been a misunderstanding between America and Europe. Chris Meyer, Britain's former ambassador to the United States, recently said that Europe is schizophrenic sometimes about the United States. When we don't act, they're critical, and when we do act, sometimes Europe is critical. And I've really noticed that. When I was here at Davos 4 years ago, right now, we had just elected President Bush the first time, and many Europeans came to me because they knew I knew the president and said, please encourage him and your country to remain engaged. Remember, the concern then was that the United States was simply going to disengage from Europe and disengage from the world arena, and the world really wanted America's involvement. And I understand that with Iraq, with some recent developments, it's hard to remember those days when the world did want us involved, but it has been the case in the past, and I believe it will be the case again in the future. I think that Senator Hatch spoke well to remind some that it was American involvement in Bosnia that stopped the killing of Muslims by so-called Christians. That sometimes America has, I would argue, in fact, in almost all cases, America has been a force for good. My uncle died in France defending Europe and defending the United States. And we're not an imperialist power. Afghanistan goes to its first elections in history literally almost within months of Europe and American involvement. I can't imagine why Europe and why the civilized world isn't reacting more to the pictures from Iraq of election workers being murdered in the streets, of the violence from one sect, from one part of that country against democracy. And I guess I'll close with what Tony Blair said the other day. I think it was in the Financial Times, where Prime Minister Blair said, you know, as a progressive, I remember when progressives were strongly supportive of freedom and democracy. And he was reacting to the criticism of President Bush's inaugural address, where he simply said, we're on the side of freedom. We're going to stand up for democracy. It was not an invasive speech. It was very similar to Woodrow Wilson and John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt and what they said. And I guess what I'm always amazed at is democracies don't war with one another. They simply don't go to war with one another. Today, 60% of the world is governed by some level of democracy, and that part of the world doesn't fight with each other, really. And it's hard to find any example of democratic nations fighting. So I would hope that what could unite Europe and America would be simply a belief in freedom and a belief in democracy. If for no other reason, then typically that helps lead to a more peaceful world.
Thank you very much. Joe, just to bring you up to date, I'm asking everyone what their trip report is going to be when they get home to their colleagues. And just a quick introduction, and we'll go down to the other questions. So give us your impressions.
I guess the headline would be, they haven't gotten over it. Look, there is an awful lot of disappointment in Europe.
Joe, get a little closer to the mic.
There's an awful lot of disappointment in Europe and around the world, rightly or wrongly, in terms of the outcome of the American election. And there's I've sensed, I've been coming here a long time, a continuation of the concern that the administration is going to be more business as usual. The truth is, I think that the administration was somewhat arrogant and somewhat unilateral in its first 4 years. I think, Governor, had the president made the inaugural speech he made this inauguration, the first inauguration, it would have been applauded. It would have been applauded in Europe. It would have been applauded around the world. But I think it is the concern that I hear expressed, not only here, but as I travel the world. In the last 8 weeks, I've traveled extensively, particularly through the Middle East and Iraq and other places. And wherever I go, and it's been amplified by the president's inaugural this time, that they read into freedom and the spread of freedom unilateral invasion by American forces to impose a democratic regime, quote unquote. I don't believe the president believes that. I believe the president's going through a genuine transition. You've seen how he's changed 3 times since he's been elected president. This is the guy who criticized the heck out of me for beating up on Clinton for 4 years for trying to get into Bosnia. This is a fellow who and his party in the House of Representatives blocked a resolution for the use of force in Kosovo. This is a president who represented a wing of the party that thought we should disengage. Then this is a president who, after 9/11, took on a readily available doctrine, if you will, that had been in place for 20, 25 years. No one paid attention to it very much, the so-called neoconservative view of the world. It was convenient. It wasn't just convenient. It had 4 corners to it. It was fully digestible, and it seemed to have some sound rationale to it, and he adopted it. Whole lock, stock, and barrel. And then you've seen him move from that. I noticed in his press conference, I'll end with this, I noticed in his press conference, first press conference after the inauguration, when asked about his call to spread freedom, he said it will take generations. No one here in Europe heard that part, that it will take generations. And so I always find myself in a strange position, I was saying to Senator Dodd when I'm here, because I never criticize my president when I'm abroad, of defending the man with whom I have a stark disagreement on foreign policy. But I really think it's important, the second part of the report, and I'll do it in less than a paragraph, is that the Europeans and others have to begin to get over, let me put it this way. You and I talked about this, Tom. I attended a conference of European leaders in Italy about 4 months ago. And they were all saying, maybe a little long enough, it was in September. They were all saying, literally, uniformly, hope Kerry wins, with notable exception. And I was on a panel like this. I was the only American there, though. And I said, be careful what you wish for. You may get it. Because if Kerry wins, you'll no longer have Bush as an excuse for your irresponsibility. You're bled for the Iraqi people during the embargo. I mean, you bled openly. It was all over the front page of every paper. The Iraqi people are desperately in need of help. They're desperately in need of debt forgiveness. They're desperately in need of food. They're desperately in need of everything. We're not asking you to send troops. Send sandwiches. Seriously, I'm not joking. I'm being a little too facetious here. But so Europe, I think, has to get beyond the transgressions of the Bush administration and begin to focus a little bit on what they need to do as well. Conclusion, I hope Bush is going to shed an ideology for the pragmatism he showed as governor in his second term, because if he clings to the ideology of the neoconservatives, we're in real trouble, Europe's in real trouble, the world is in real trouble.
If you want to know what Joe thinks, he'll be available afterwards. So. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, walking the halls here, probably the question I've gotten most is Iran next? Is Iran next? In fact, it's the cover of Der Spiegel this week, a big, bold headline, Jim, is Iran next, with a picture of President Bush. My answer has been to say to people, psst, come over here, a little closer. Now, whatever you do, don't tell the Iranians this, okay? But we're not going anywhere, okay? Because we are maxed out. As they say in American baseball, Europe, you're up, okay? You're up. You've been hawking us to do multilateral diplomacy to prove that there are alternatives to the use of force. Well, as Cambridge Energy Associates just said in their recent report, we are now outsourcing Iran to you. Let's see if there is a multilateral diplomatic alternative. Because as Senator Biden said, Europe's been getting off a little bit easy, a little bit of drive-by foreign policy. You drive by the American embassy and you just say, George W. Bush. And everybody laughs, or everybody sneers. And it's a good living if you can get it, but it's making people stupid because it's relieving them of the responsibility to think seriously about the world. So my question to you, Jim, and to your colleagues, is Iran next? Or have we outsourced it necessarily to Europe? And are they now going to have to prove that they've got something more than a drive-by foreign policy?
Well, I think you've defined the situation remarkably well, Tom. But I don't think the United States and Israel have totally foreclosed an option of force. And the reason they haven't is that there is no thought of an Iraqi type of circumstance. And the thought of the those that are advocating an Iranian intervention, the intervention would be from 30,000 feet. And that type of intervention is considered more sterile. I happen to profoundly believe it would be a mistake of truly extraordinary proportions. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, there are groups in Washington that advocate that policy.
Still alive, you're saying?
Yes. Now, Europe, to the degree that you're saying that we're outsourcing, we're not outsourcing. Europe is doing this on their own. And Europe has played a very forthright, I believe, commendable role in seeking negotiated resolution. Again, if we're honest with ourselves, Europe hasn't quite succeeded. And we all have a vested interest that Europe do that. Because we're in Switzerland, I like to quote a Swiss German, a chap named Einstein, who once commented that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And I think that is something we all have to dwell upon. This is a very serious circumstance. Hopefully it can be resolved diplomatically, and the United States obviously is in no great position to act out. I think if we did, or if we did with an ally, or if an ally did with our implicit support, it would be potentially exceedingly counterproductive. I think we'd be making of Iran a enemy mortal for many decades, and I think we'd be making of the Islamic world a gifted circumstance for radicalism that could deepen and lengthen, and therefore we should be very, very cautious. Caution should be the watchword.
Senator Biden, is Europe capable of anything more than a carrots and carrot strategy when it comes to Iran?
It is capable of it, but whether or not it will and do anything else is in question. I think our administration has three options. One, they outsource completely, and I think that goes nowhere because, quite frankly, I don't think there's any European leader who's really willing to take this to the Security Council. Because they know what the outcome would be, and then they'd be faced with a series of difficult dilemmas that they don't want to face. And there's the second option the administration has, which is only a very small number of administration officials share it, and that's what Jim referred to. I think there still are some within the administration who thinks there is not a military solution, but a military action that can produce a solution. There are those in the administration, a small number, hopefully the president doesn't agree, who thinks that if we used military force, that is, going after nuclear installations, and we can't do what was done before because they're spread all over, that in and of itself would generate cause for a spontaneous Iranian uprising, and they'd overthrow the government. Misses the point that I think there is a national yearning for nuclear capability that would exist even if Iran was a democracy. And so there's a third option that's not being very much considered in the administration, and I think the only one that is a reasonable option. And that is we have to engage with the Europeans as fully as the Europeans are, because the only possible, and I don't hold out a great hope for it, the only possible diplomatic solution rests in what some of the neocons in the administration are unwilling to do, and the president may be unwilling to do, and that is that Iran, the only possibility everyone knows is the quid pro quo for the renunciation of a nuclear program and an elimination of a missile program is guarantee of us not forcibly overthrowing or seeking the overthrow. In other words, a non-aggression pact with an evil empire or an axis of evil. I happen to think that's the route we should be going, and we should test it out. And we should bring the Europeans along. We should make it clear we're willing to provide carrots, not just sticks, so that if and when the Iranians reject it, as I think they probably would, then the Europeans are on the horns of a dilemma. They either support us in a seriously difficult effort of providing economic sanctions, which will surely include oil, or they acknowledge that they're prepared to live with the inevitable and stop making this argument about how we are unilateral interventionists. I think they're the three options. The administration is debating which of the two to adopt. I hope the third one comes into play, because I think it's the only rational one.
Senator Dodd.
Same
question. That's on Iran. How do you see the options? Do you think we still have military options on our table, or basically is this going to be the Europeans' ball to carry?
Well, firstly, my point of view, you never say never. I know that you made at some point under circumstances, but you don't ever, given the potentiality here, you don't want to take that arrow out of your quiver. You don't draw it out early, as we've seen the painful lessons of that. But here, I certainly would not want to see the President or others eliminate that option. The question sort of implies, and I know you don't mean this, but is Iran next? And there's such tremendous differences on the ground between Iraq post-invasion and Iran as it is today, that the military option, while I wouldn't take it off the table, ought to be very far from the administration's thinking. We've got a tremendous opportunity, not just the United States now, talking about our collective effort. Iran has been through 3 elections where the opposition, the more liberal democratic influences, have won overwhelmingly in every one of them. There's a tremendous opportunity if we handle this with any deftness at all to really talk about not only changing the dynamic when it comes to the nuclear arsenal, but building a very strong relationship with a country in the very near future, in my view. So I would underscore what Joe has suggested. I think that makes the most sense to approach it that way. Someone we ought to work together on it and get about it fairly quickly. There's a dynamic here. There's the simultaneity of events. I think we're focused obviously today and tomorrow on the elections in Iraq. But I was tremendously heartened, and this was not part of your question, but heartened by the sense of optimism that is being felt in recent days in the Middle East, Palestine, Israel. There's some real opportunities. Even people who have been rather dark about anything ever happening, I'm hearing words that I haven't ever heard before about the real possibility of something lasting emerging here. If that can happen, and if Iran can happen in a positive way, and Iraq may be the most troublesome in the longer term, but that could really alter and change fundamentally the relationships in this part of the world. So I would hope that the administration would pursue that. And I think they've got to be careful. The rhetoric is dangerous. Words mean things, particularly when they come from very senior government officials. And the most recent press releases and comments are going to make it harder, I think, to do what Joe has suggested to be done. Because you're going to have to weigh through the language of putting that arrow, the military arrow, if you will, up awfully early in the discussion. I think that's hurting this. So I hope they'd back off some of that language.
Senator Hatch, same question.
Well, you know, we know that through Iran are coming an awful lot of the insurgents who have been killing not only the police there that we're trying to train, but Iraqis, American soldiers, through Syria as well. If that continues, certainly there's going to be an awful lot of irritation on the part of our country, and I think should be on the part of every free country. I don't believe the United States is going to go to war against Iran, and I'll tell you why. There are millions of young people in Iran who are pro-Western. I have an Iranian nephew married to an American niece. He's a scientist, brilliant guy. I have all kinds of Iranian friends who are constantly concerned about this. There are many Iranians throughout Europe. The fact of the matter is that I had Iranians come up to me after the last session I was on, a couple of young Iranians who said, thank you for bringing out that there are millions of us who don't like the theocratic regime in Iran. And we need to make sure that we support these young people. They're pro-Western. They literally want a greater country. They want greater measures of freedom. I never fully talk about democracy in Iraq. I talk in terms of a representative form of government. But now let's think about something. Does anybody really believe that the six-nation negotiations that are going on over North Korea would be going on today if the United States had not acted? Does anybody really believe that Muammar Gaddafi would have given up his weapons of mass destruction programs had it not been for the seriousness with which the United States has faced terrorism? Does anybody in Europe really believe that you don't have a problem with tens of millions of Islamicists and a growing number of young people who are willing to kill themselves to kill others, to commit suicide, to kill others because they're not paying attention to French television, they're paying attention to Al Jazeera? Does anybody really believe that these problems are just going to go away? Does anybody really believe that Western Europe is not going to have tremendous problems, or that you're not having them now? Read the Wall Street Journal editorial this morning. Does anybody really believe that America has to do all of these things alone? Does anybody really believe that we're doing them for imperial reasons? Does anybody really believe that the United States should have to carry all these things and fight against terrorism without the backing of our dear friends in Europe? Well, I think there are a lot of people who might believe that, but they're wrong. The fact is that we need to band together. We have a common enemy. These are people who are committing terrorist acts. This is not a normal foe. These are people who really don't believe the way we do, who are not dedicated to freedom. Now, I'd much rather have, though, if we have to go in to any of these nations, I'd much rather have the United States do it than to have Israel. Because I believe if Israel has to take them out, or take out atomic weapons if the Iranians are lying to us, I believe you got World War III on your hands, or at least something pretty close to it, or certainly a lot of threat. So nobody should be snide about the United States and the work that we're doing. We're not happy that we're in Iraq. But we know one thing, hundreds of thousands of people were murdered, men, women, and children, by this terrible regime. And we also know that Saddam Hussein would never have stopped had it not been for us taking him on. That's the way it was. There are other areas in the world also, but this is a significant area, because if World War III starts, it's likely to be out of the Middle East. So we can't just sit back and act like everything's going to go all right. And then again, we have to approach these things intelligently. We could use good advice from our friends in Western Europe. But it isn't advice of throwing your hands in the air and saying we can't do anything about terrorism. We've got to do everything we possibly can. Our children and our future generations depend on what we do now. So I think we ought to all reanalyze, we ought to quit criticizing, we ought to do what we can to band together, because when we do, the world's a better place.
Joe, I want to give you a chance for, you said, does anyone, and the senator from Delaware raised his hand, so I'm going to give him a 60-second.
I don't want to interrupt.
Okay, fine. Governor Owens.
I'll be brief. I think it's important to understand why it is, at least the United States, and we hope Europe is concerned about whether Iran is moving towards nuclear weapons. The International Atomic Energy Agency has, over recent years, consistently found areas of misrepresentation, areas of subterfuge, areas where outside of diplomatic circles you would say that Iran has lied about what it is doing in terms of developing its nuclear potential. Some of us wonder, why does a country that is as rich in natural resources as Iran want to go through something as expensive to develop as electricity from nuclear power? The same reason why some of us wonder why a country that can't feed its people even at the subsistence level like North Korea is all of a sudden deciding to develop electricity from nuclear power. These are important questions for the civilized world. And if we're right, and if my country and our official position is that Iran is trying to develop weapons potential from nuclear energy, and if we're right, millions of people's lives could be at risk. If we're wrong, then we have unfairly accused two wonderful nations of doing something that they're not actually doing. But we're not making it up in terms of what Iran is apparently doing. Go to the files of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Look at their warnings. Look at the history. Look at what's in fact happening. Now, the U.S. has been working with our European friends. We've consistently, I believe, followed the European approach. Let's continue to try to see if there will be a regime change in terms of how Iran is dealing with this issue. And we're continuing to hope that our worst fears aren't realized. And I think Tom Friedman's opening question and opening analysis is correct. This would be a wonderful opportunity for Europe to step up and show that, that it's capable of dealing with potentially a significant threat. Will the U.S. use military force? I doubt it. I agree with Chris Dodd. We should never pull back from that in the sense of you don't want to tell what you might do. I think we may be in a situation where we're almost good cop, bad cop. The U.S. right now is obviously the bad cop. The U.S. may use military force. Europe's the good cop. Europe's going to try to negotiate. Your ability to negotiate is probably enhanced by that slight chance that something might happen in the future from the bad cop. I'm an optimist. I actually think that things in the Middle East are measurably better today than they were last year, than they were 5 years ago, certainly than they were 10 years ago. You're seeing moderate regimes, moderate governments in Jordan, and you're seeing movement towards representation and better governments throughout the region. We're seeing a true chance for peace in the Middle East, and I don't think it's entirely inconsistent with what American policy has been in that region. I was with President Bush a couple of years ago in the Roosevelt Room, 6 or 7 other governors, and he said, you know, 10 years from now you may say that I was wrong, but I think in my term as president, we're going to see peace between Israel and Palestine. And I think we're seeing that in recent weeks, and we'll continue to hope for that improvement.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I thought I'd open the floor now and see if there are any questions out there. Let's just promise me you'll keep them brief, and please, right there. And would you direct it to whoever you'd like to answer the question?
Thank you very much.
Please
my name is Adeli. I am from Iran. As Iran was referred to very much, I just want to have 3 points here and direct my question to Senator Biden.
Okay, really quick.
Yes. First of all, I think that some of the references made to the terrorists and also was confused with Iranian nation. Iran started fighting Al-Qaeda before America did. Iran cooperated with America in Afghanistan to fight against Taliban. Iran cooperated with America and the coalition forces in Iraq to keep the majority of the people of Iraq calm and go for the election. So I think that there is some misperception of Iran in this case. On the nuclear issue, just again, there is a confusion with the other countries. Iran has signed non-proliferation treaty. Iran has opened to the IAEA by signing even the additional protocol, giving access to the inspectors to go there. And in the same resolutions that was referred by Governor Owen by IAEA, there are at least 3 times reference that there has not been any evidence in Iran that the exercise of technology over there has been diverted to nuclear or non-peaceful purposes. I think that if we should have some references, IAEA was established by the world community and UN to be the reference. The reference is them. We have established a level of confidence, some level of confidence with the Europeans. We have recently engaged with them. We have signed an accord in Paris to go for giving them as much as they would be convinced that there is not any intention in Iran to divert the
I just want to give other people a chance to ask questions,
and,
so
yes.
Make it quick and get to the question.
And the last thing is about the reform. This country is representative. There are some flaws in Iran. It is accepted that we don't have perfect democracy, but the democracy is an evolutionary process which started since the revolution. And it has got now to a very high level where President Khatami and the young generation are pursuing their ways. I would warn the United States not to do the same mistake it did in 1953 to overthrow a very elected government in Iran. I think that this is something that you should allow, that the pace of democracy and reform, which is far better than many other developing countries in that region or outside of that region, which we are proud of it. Of course, we have some problems in that. So this is why I would wonder how Senator Biden would say that you would give Iran, with all of these assertions that we would like to be engaged with the world, we would like to prove to the Europeans and the rest of the world that we are not for the nuclear weapons. At the same time, we would like to really get a better democracy. How would you support this process instead?
Yeah, I think we should separate fiction from reality. What I did say was we should be negotiating with you. We should be discussing this with you. We should be engaged with the Europeans. The Europeans at this point do not believe that you, in fact, only have peaceful use of nuclear energy in mind. That's why they're so skeptical about what's going on. That's why Al-Baradei and others want more assurances. Number two, you are not, the best of my knowledge, have not been cooperating with Al-Qaeda, but you are the godfather of Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization which you are funding and you are sending into the Middle East. Number three, the reform movement of the Modulus, that was the popularly elected people that my friend from Utah referenced, you wiped them out. You, your government, your clerical leadership decided who could and who could not serve and who could run and who could not run. So I think we should talk. I think we should be engaged. But I think we should be real. And the fact is, there is no reform movement alive in Iran right now. It has been crushed. The fact is, you are supporting Hezbollah, which is spreading terror throughout the region. And the fact is, the IAEA has grave doubts about you. Maybe you can solve those doubts. I hope you can. I hope everyone agrees you are not using any of this for nuclear purposes, but I have my doubts. Having said all that, we still should engage you and talk to you and figure out what you need to be brought in to the world in terms of your commitments to freedom and democracy, as well as a non-nuclear state.
Right there. No, just move over here.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm Martin Varsavsky from the Varsavsky Foundation. And just, my question to the panelists relates to the United Nations. We've been talking a lot about the relationship with Europe. There's been a strong sense from people in Europe and around the world that there's a very aggressive policy from the Bush administration against the United Nations, like personally against Kofi Annan. In fact, 70 Nobel Prizes just came out saying that Kofi Annan should be supported. And I wanted to ask that question. What is your view vis-a-vis Kofi Annan personally and the United Nations, and how come the United Nations hasn't been mentioned in this debate so far?
Questions about the United Nations are boring. They're not allowed on my panel. Senator Hatch, take a whack at that.
Well, I did mention the United Nations. I mentioned that President Bush has spoken to the United Nations more than any other president in his first 4 years. Be that acceptable or not to certain nations. But yes, we want to work within the United Nations. We certainly spend a lot of money trying to make sure that we support the United Nations. And is the United Nations perfect? Hardly. On the other hand, there are so many inner conflicts and difficulties, but that's what democracy is all about, too.
Senator Hatch, do you have a take on the whole Kofi Annan question?
I'll do that.
Okay.
As you know, our colleague from Minnesota, Senator Coleman, has called for the resignation of Kofi Annan, but he's almost singular in that call. The rest of us are very concerned about the oil for food process and the fraud that went on there. There are some things that were not transparent and still aren't. We're going to have to look at that, and he is the head of that organization, but hardly any of us, to my knowledge, have called for his resignation. I personally respect the man and hope that he is free of taint. But we do need transparency in that area. Where there is fraud, where there is criminality, it ought to be exposed. And he ought to lead the fight to expose it. He ought to be the first to want to expose it, because we don't want the United Nations to fail. And the quickest way for it to fail is to lose transparency. So I wish him well. I hope that he can continue to do a decent job. It's a tough job because of all the nations involved and the disparity of opinions. But we also have to get to the bottom of what appears to be blatant and very bad fraud.
Chris, take a whack at that also, if you will.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, and it has come up on a couple of occasions, and this is. This forum here is going to sound an awful lot like a love-in here, and it's important that some distinctions be drawn. And as I said at the outset, and the question that Tom asked, my view is we need to get to those issues where there's some commonality of purpose, which are serious ones. I was pointed out during the Senate confirmation hearings, the new Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, asked the question of Dr. Rice, prefaced the question by saying the one question that President Bush and John Kerry were asked, on which they agreed, was what was the most serious issue facing the United States or the world, and they both answered nuclear proliferation. And I think there's common agreement here. This is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, and we ought to be working at that question and others where we have a common interest to resolve it. But there has been, Orrin, and as my friend, I tell you this, there is a denigration that's occurred over the last 4 years of international institutions. It was an applause line, excuse me, an applause line at the Republican National Convention to sort of attack the United Nations. Now, you're not going to score any great political points in the United States by standing up and defending the UN. People have they're skeptical about an organization that can't seem to come to any conclusions about anything. But I would argue, in a sense, the United States and Europe, but principally the United States, was the principal architect of these international organizations at the end of World War II, because there hadn't been any prior to that time, where you might be able to go. We never give the institution credit enough for the matters that they resolve there. Obviously, we're always disappointed by the ones that don't get resolved. But there is this, and I think this has a lot to do with the friction between Europe and the United States, going to your first question, and that is sort of a disdain about international cooperation and working through international organizations to try and solve some of these problems. Now, it may just be language and rhetoric, but I think it rubs people the wrong way. And when you're trying to do, on the issue of Iran, as Joe has suggested and Orrin did, that we work together and cooperatively, it gets harder to get to that point if there's a trail. The Kyoto agreements, the International Criminal Court, the missile defense systems. And I'm not suggesting for a single second that anyone should have necessarily signed on to those agreements as they were proposed. But the idea that we walked away from the table, walked away completely, even before we decided we didn't like the agreements, and then turn around and say, now listen, we want you to join us on Iraq, we'd like you to help on Iran, a few other places. It's harder. Human relationships, whether between individuals or nations, get difficult if you've got a trail of lacking respect in terms of each other's opinions. So I don't mean to go back, but I just think it's an important point. And the language has to change on this stuff if we're going to be more successful.
Let's see if there are any over here.
Thank you, Tom. Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. Senator Hatch, you said, quote, the U.S. has never been an imperialist nation. I suspect that would be a surprise to the Filipinos, the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans. Senator Dodd, you mentioned that in the last 3 Iranian elections, reformers have won them all. That would be a surprise to the 2,000 or so candidates that were disallowed by the clerics, and the clerics now control the Majlis. Governor Owens, you expressed...
I am going to ask you for a question, not a critique.
But I want to hear my critique.
Okay.
Right.
At least
go ahead.
Right. I've enjoyed the first 2.
Yeah.
Pay no attention to me.
You mentioned...
As long as you don't critique me, keep going.
You're one of my favorites. Senator Owens, you said that you were surprised that a country...
Governor Owens.
Governor Owens. So resource-rich, like Iran, would want to develop nuclear power. Well, that would be a surprise to... what was it, GE and Westinghouse, that developed nuclear power in a country that was the world's leading producer of oil, and that, of course, was the United States. I guess I'm being facetious, but I suspect people in the audience would wonder why Americans don't know history all that well, and shouldn't you?
Since I was the first.
Anybody? Joe, he started with Orrin, and then we'll work down. No, it's okay.
I think we understand.
Everybody gets a chance.
I think we understand history, and we understand American history. Now, we may make some mistakes in that from time to time, but I think the Filipinos believe that they're free, and I think every other nation that we've once been involved with thinks they're free. I think of World War I. I think of World War II. I think of a lot of other things. I know history, and I can tell you right now, this is not an imperialist nation. We're a nation that has stood for freedom. Now, you might differ with us, but don't accuse us of being imperialists. Now, let me just say something. This is an important debate. There's room for different views. We believe that's what the United Nations is for, in many respects, at least partially. We believe that there are differences in this audience. We respect those differences. But let me tell you something. I believe Western nations better work together through dialogue, diplomacy, and yes, force if we have to protect the free people of this world. And there are many variations to that, and our colleagues can agree and disagree from time to time on what those variations should be. But let me tell you something. What's going on in Iraq is extremely important. Saddam Hussein was a villain, and what he did to those people and the world at large was wrong. And I appreciated Senator Biden's comments about Iranian Hezbollah and the other sponsorship of terrorism throughout the Middle East. I am heartened by the fact, as all of us are up here, that there seems to be a new hope between Palestine and Israel. And I can say that that's a hope every one of us ought to get on our knees and pray for. But don't misconstrue. The United States is not a pushover when it comes to protecting our interests, when it comes to protecting the world against terrorism, and when it comes to standing up for our allies when they've needed us. And we've done it time after time, and we'd like to have our allies stand up with us against terrorism throughout this world in a whole wide variety of ways, not all of which have to be military.
Senator, let me get everyone in here. Senator Biden.
You know, we had a colleague, and you probably knew him, Senator Simpson. He had a great line he always uses: everyone's entitled to their own opinion. They're not entitled to their own facts. I think it's kind of important in the disarray that exists now, regardless of whether it's warranted or unwarranted. The United States is held in a relatively low regard around the world. And regardless of whose fault, we ought to take a look at the facts. The facts are, as it relates to, I'll just pick one example you pick, sir. The difference between the United States seeking nuclear power and Iran. We knew in 1950 there wasn't enough oil or coal for us to meet all of our energy needs. We knew that. Evidence the fact we're importing 60% of our energy, our oil, from abroad. Iran has no need, none whatsoever. They can meet all of their energy needs and their projected energy needs from their resources now. Now, there is a good reason why Iran should want nuclear power. I would argue that there's not, I have an incredible disdain and disregard for the clerical leadership of your country. But I have an incredibly high regard for your people. But I believe if tomorrow there were a genuine democracy elected in Iran, they would still want a nuclear weapon. Why? Just be rational. They live in a dangerous neighborhood. And so instead of us talking about whether you're entitled to or not entitled to, whether you have good or bad intentions, it's a universal view in Iran, as it is in India. No matter which party's in charge, they want nuclear power, or nuclear capability. So what we should be doing is using our imaginations to give you a reason why your psychological need, thinking you're going to guarantee your security by having a nuclear weapon, is not required of you. And that is by the international community, including the United States, giving you a guarantee for your security. Japan could have a nuclear weapon tomorrow. They could be a nuclear power literally overnight. Why they have not sought it beyond any treaty obligation? They've had a nuclear umbrella. We think not very logically when we come to international relations. So let's get it straight. They want a nuclear weapon. They have no interest, and you know it in your gut as well as I do. They want but there's not an irrational drive. There's nothing irrational about it. So we should deal with the rational side of it and figure out how can we prevent you from acquiring a nuclear weapon and still feel secure. That's the failure of the international community. That's the failure of the international institutions. That's the failure of the leadership of this country and the Europeans right now, in my view.
I want to keep going around to the floor, if we could.
What was the point did you misunderstand what I was saying? I was talking about the 3 elections, and there was 2/3 though that voted that came from the sort of the opposition voice. I wasn't sort of condoning what ultimately occurs and who's disregarded. The point I was trying to make is that Iran is very different than Iraq. in terms of being a substantial part of that population that I think has a very different view in terms of where they want us to go. That was all the point I was trying to make.
You had a question? Yeah, right there. Yeah, go ahead.
Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch. I'd like to address an opportunity we have to maybe find common ground around an international institution. And this stems from the ethnic cleansing in Darfur, where President Bush has played a very strong job and done a great job in bringing international attention to that crisis. There's a UN investigative committee that is reported to Kofi Annan this week and reportedly is recommending that the killers in Khartoum be brought to justice. And it discusses two options. One is the idea of setting up a brand new court for Sudan, which it says is not a good idea because it would take a year to get going, it's expensive, you'd lose that deterrent value while people are being killed every day. The other option is the International Criminal Court. Now, obviously, the Bush administration has had trouble with the International Criminal Court, but it's mainly objected to the court when the independent prosecutor on his own chooses who to prosecute. It's never objected to the idea of the Security Council setting the agenda for the court, which is the only way that Darfur could be put before the International Criminal Court. Would you advise the Bush administration in this restricted case to at least abstain when the issue of Darfur being sent to the International Criminal Court comes before the Security Council?
I'm going to ask Congressman Leach to take that.
Absolutely, and you raised a subtlety that's a very profound one on the International Criminal Court. There is a possibility of consensus between the United States and the rest of the world if one uses the Security Council as, in effect, the grand jury for consideration of who should be brought before it. I think that is a very tenable way that all countries in the world can accept the criminal court. Obviously, Washington is very concerned with, particularly when there's military action underway, that our military might be brought before a court by in a way that might be awkward for our society. But I think both Darfur should be used as in that model, and I think if we can just modify slightly the ICC as it currently exists, I think you get United States support for it.
All the questions have been from men. Are there any ladies in the audience who have a question? Am I missing anybody? Right there.
Absolutely.
Oh, there are. Okay. Yeah, all the way back there. Sorry, I tried.
Thank you. Not a woman.
It's okay.
Bill Pace, and I'm with the World Federalist Movement. 2 points. One is on, and I know, Mr. Friedman, you don't want to hear about it, is the UN, but Governor Owens, I think the Colorado state budget is somewhere between $8 billion and $12 billion a year at this point. And I don't know how many thousands of employees you have. But,
too many.
But Kofi Annan's budget is $1.4 billion a year. I was from Wyoming. The Wyoming governor's budget is twice Kofi Annan's budget. So when we look at how the UN works and operates, I think we need to keep in mind the enormously small amount that we're spending. The entire UN system, the Health Organization, IAEA, all of it together is less than $20 billion, a little less than Mr. Dodd's state governor's budget, et cetera. So that's 1 point. On the sanctions issue, my group was one of the few that supported the sanctions, and I have 2 points to make here. One is that, and this is in Iraq, we became very, very concerned about the effect that the sanctions were having. But while we were watching this, it was clear to us, or all the information we had, was that this was mainly being overseen not by the SG, but by the Security Council, and in particular the United States and the United Kingdom. And so I hope we can wait until we see Mr. Volker's and Judge Goldstone's report before we jump to judgment on that. And if the report shows that there were serious frauds, it should be dealt with. But many of us thought that the way the Congress was looked at as attacking the Secretary General was more about his criticism of the U.S. Behavior towards the UN.
Great, thank you. Governor Owens.
As the only person up here who's not from Congress, it wasn't Congress attacking Kofi Annan. It was a good friend of many of ours, one senator, Norm Coleman of Minnesota, who has raised, for debating purposes, some very important points. I'm in favor of the United Nations. I'm an internationalist. I believe that in order to have a strong United Nations, you have to have the courage to be able to say that even the United Nations may make mistakes. The jury is still out. You're exactly right. We have to wait for the Volcker report to see. But there is substantial amount of evidence, at least to some, that suggests there were problems with the Food for Peace, with that program, and with the sanctions as well. And as a friend of the United Nations, I hope that A, we don't find that, and B, if we do, that the United Nations is strong enough to reform itself, because it's the need for it has never been greater in terms of the WHO and all of the important things it does. Please don't misunderstand that a senator or senators and congressmen represent the position of the American government, and as an American, I know you wouldn't make that mistake. And secondly, that people who appreciate an organization nevertheless can't be concerned if in fact it's done something wrong, because those who truly love that organization are those, I believe, who are willing to reform it.
Right here.
We've talked about the urgency.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name's Ed Scott. I'm with an organization called the Center for Global Development. It's a D.C. think tank. We've talked about the urgency of the situation in Iraq, and it is an urgent situation, but we haven't talked hardly at all about North Korea. And North Korea is making the Japanese think it isn't such a friendly neighborhood. And they're starting to get real itchy about having a bomb. And they know something about atomic bombs, by the way. So the question is, these guys are locked and loaded north of the 38th parallel. What are we going to do about it, and how are we going to crank up the urgency of that issue?
Anybody? Joe, go ahead.
There has been in the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, a bipartisan consensus, Lugar and Biden, who've been arguing for 3 years that we should directly, not negotiate, engage North Korea. The six-party talks are useful, but everyone involved in the six-party talks, including the 4 other parties other than the United States and North Korea, all have told us personally, me personally, and privately told everyone knows, that ultimately those six-party talks, at some point, the United States and Korea have to go off in a room by themselves. And what we have to find out is whether or not there is any condition under which the North Koreans are willing to give up their capability, which they clearly possess now, and also their missile capability. I'm not sure they are, but I'm sure we've got to try to figure out and find out whether they are. And if we do not, through those six-party talks and with us, our direct engagement, reach a resolution, you're going to have a nuclearized Korean peninsula. Japan will become a nuclear power. China will increase its nuclear capability to respond to the perceived threat from Japan becoming a nuclear power. We're going to be a whole hell of a lot less secure. Bottom line, the fundamental problem or benefit, depending on your perspective, with this administration's thinking about Iran and Iran and North Korea, is that in both cases, there's no one that I have discussed this with, left, right, or center, European, Asian, American, who doesn't say that there is no possibility of an agreement absent a non-aggression pact on the part of the United States with the Iranian government or with the North Korean government. And for some of the leaders within this administration, I perceive that to be the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and some others, For them to agree to a non-aggression pact or some version of it with those, quote, from their perspective, despotic governments is a little bit like me as a Roman Catholic denying the Trinity. It's not possible. And so the ultimate stumbling block here is, I believe the reason why there's been no face-to-face engagement and we've stayed away from the European efforts with regard to Iran is because the administration knows at the end of the day they're going to have to come face-to-face with the question of whether or not they're willing to say in a formal sense they'll do nothing to destabilize two regimes which they believe, and I quite frankly believe as well, but they believe are inimical to the interest of the United States and of the world. And it is that basic. They haven't crossed that threshold. Until they do, I don't think anything is going to actually happen, except as time goes on, we're in a position where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. North Korea has 400% greater nuclear capacity today than when George Bush became president of the United States. And George Bush has no alternative. Here's his dilemma. There is no military alternative that is likely to get the support of anyone else in the world. For the first shot fired on North Korea by the United States, somewhere between 250 and 300,000 South Koreans are likely to die. It's going to be tough. So that's the fundamental dilemma, and it's a tough one. I'm not making light of it. It's a very tough dilemma.
Senator Hatch, a quick intervention.
Just one further thought, and that is that it's very important for us to continue our relationships with China, because China will have more influence on this than anybody else, and it is in China's best interests, extremely best interests, to make sure that North Korea is under control. And they're about the only ones right now that you can conclude reasonably have the best chance of doing that. So I just wanted to make that point.
Right down here.
Afsane Basirpur, I'm correspondent for Le Monde, but I'm also Iranian. The reformers in Iran think that the only solution is for the U.S. to engage with Iran. But they also wonder whether the U.S. would even have participated in any kind of a dialogue with North Korea if it didn't have the bomb.
Good question. Good question. Anyone? Next question. Thank you. Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead. Take a whack, and your colleagues will think while you're talking. Go ahead.
It is. I think that the notion abroad is that the only way you get the attention of the United States at all, and the only way you're ever able to bargain, is if you have the threat of or the actual possession of a nuclear weapon. And ironically, I think that this administration has created that impression because they have so discounted the notion of deterrence. They have widely said that nuclear retaliatory capability on the part of the United States, which is overwhelming, is not a deterrent. Therefore, they have discounted, in effect, the value of the one means by which nuclear peace was kept for the past 60 years. And so it raises the ante, it seems to me, in countries like Iran and South Korea. North Korea is a different animal in many ways. No, I don't mean that in a critical way. A different nation. That will be mistranslated in a way that's not intended. But a different nation in that it is truly the last of the isolated governments in the world that I think is fully out of touch with reality in its own sense. They're not in that circumstance. And so, but the one thing that I found interesting, when Senators Lugar and Hagel and Biden and others went to the administration and said, and I actually talked to you about this, Tom, that we should be actively engaging 4 years ago the democracy movement, which is not necessarily pro-Western. I don't demand Iran be pro-Western. I just like to be a democratic nation. I'll take my bets with that. But when we try to engage the members of the modulus, when we tried to actually reach out, there were two things that happened. There was a great debate in Iran on the front page of every one of your papers, where I was referred to as the new Satan because I was trying to somehow molest the minds of the democratic movement in Iraq by wanting to meet with them. And secondly, my administration made it real clear that they didn't want any engagement at any level with anyone within Iran. And now the president has made an inaugural speech where he says he wants to reach out and support democratic movements wherever they exist. And the irony is that we missed an opportunity. Would it have worked? I don't know. But to the extent that the rest of the world was engaging the democratic reformers in your former country, would have, I think, made it more difficult for the clerics to be able to crush it as clearly and in the face of the whole world as they did. And so I would argue that we should be engaging in any way we can, any what I'd now call dissident movement seeking democratic direction in Iran, and all nations of the world should attempt to do that as well. We have to begin to rebuild the process.
I just want to add just one. Chris, I want to add one thing, if I could, before, sure. which is because I want to go back to the point raised by the Iranian gentleman, because it's obviously sparked a lot of discussion here, and there's a lot of discussion about Iran here. And you made the point that Iran kind of has its own democracy and it's in evolution, but Iran had its revolution in 1979. It's been an evolution for 35 years, and democracy means. If it means anything, it means people who want to run for office are allowed to run for office, and a group of people aren't allowed to select who can run and who can't run. That's not democracy. That's something else. There are no bikinis at nudist colonies. They don't serve steak in vegetarian restaurants. Okay? That's not an evolution. That's something else. And you don't get to call that democracy.
Yeah. I just want to, and I don't know whether, good point. I would put North Korea and Iran in different situations, and I think Joe probably explained that pretty well. I also happen to feel that there's not a great likelihood, obviously a possibility, that either Iran or North Korea would actually use nuclear weapons. The nation states, and I think to know in the case of Iran, they've got Pakistan, India, possibly Israel, other places who would respond if they used it somehow. It would flatten Tehran or do other things. And the North Koreans probably the same if they were to go off and use it against South Korea. The danger I've always felt, that I thought made the most sense from a European and U.S. perspective, is given the fragility of particularly in Iran, delicate given opposition and the like, less so in North Korea, but given a history that they have of exporting these weapons around the world, or exporting weapons around the world, that my concern would be that something else would happen in Iran, or they would decide to sell this material somehow to those who would then, terrorist organizations. That's my really great, I have less of a concern about even the present government of Tehran, for not because they necessarily want to feel restrained in some way, but because of what the obvious consequences would be. I guess the best analogy to draw is the Cold War, where it was the mutually assured destruction for almost half a century that really protected, if you will, the world from the use of nuclear weapons. But the fear I have deep down, and why I think we need to pursue this issue as aggressively as we can, is that those weapons ending up in the hands of people who would have no reluctance whatsoever to use them in Europe or elsewhere.
Thank you very much. We have been told our time is out. I want to thank our panelists and thank you all for the good questions. Thank you.